Welcome to APA's weekly webinar. My name is Billy Zidek, Standards and Codes Administrator for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to APA's website later this afternoon, and a follow-up email will be issued to you as a reference on where to locate the session. Professional continuing education, as well as AIA-CLU credits, are being offered for today's program. If you are an AIA professional requiring a certificate, please send an email to me at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, @apa.org, along with your AIA membership number if you have not done so in the past. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Bill Koffel of Koffel Associates. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Billy, and it's great to be here. This is actually the second program that we've done. We did one a couple weeks ago on NFPA 13 and NFPA 25. And while my intent was to focus on the responsibilities to address those of you managing facilities, in particular, typically existing buildings, existing facilities, but one of the comments we did get back was that maybe I spent a little too much time on some design issues. So we're going to refocus this, hopefully, and address your needs as one who is operating, managing facilities at a campus for higher education. This program does allow you to receive AIA continuing education units. So we just mentioned some of the boilerplate language about getting those credits and how it will be handled. A little bit more about my background, in particular as it relates to the topic this afternoon, or this morning for some of you. I'm president of Koffel Associates. We're a broad-based fire protection engineering and code consulting firm. Broad-based in that we offer a broad range of services from the design and construction, offering code consulting for design and construction projects, to designing fire protection systems, to surveying existing buildings, to doing a lot of educational activities, and also one of the things that we've done, and we've done this for APA at times, is to represent organizations and entities in the codes and standards development processes of the ICC and the NFPA. As such, I have, I think, a pretty good understanding of not only the code requirements, but the intent of those code requirements. And that's what we really want to talk about today, and in particular, how they apply to you. I have served on a number of, and continue to serve on a number of NFPA committees. One specific to our topic today, I am the immediate past chair of the correlating committee responsible for NFPA 101. That was through the 2018 edition of the document. The correlating committee doesn't necessarily deal with a lot of the technical issues, but really deals more with correlation. Are we dealing with things consistently from one occupancy to another? If not, is there a technical reason that they differ, or do the committees need to potentially come into some type of alignment? I am a past chair, not the immediate past chair, a past chair of the Life Safety Technical Committee on Means of Egress. That's responsible for Chapter 7, a large portion of what's contained in the code, even though Chapter 7 is a relatively small portion of the code. The occupancy chapters refers back to Chapter 7. So if you take those cumulative requirements, a lot of the code does deal with egress issues, as one might expect. I am currently the chair of the Life Safety Technical Committee on Healthcare Occupancies. And I've been doing this now since I graduated from Maryland with a degree in fire protection engineering from the, from the University of Maryland back in 1979. So probably more years of experience than I really care to admit at this point in time. For purposes of our discussions today, I am going to focus on the 2018 edition of the code. If any of you are affiliated with a healthcare facility on a campus or affiliated with a university, I understand that you use the 2012 edition of the code, and there will be some instances where I will try to identify where the subject matter, the content that I'm talking about is different in the 2018 edition versus the 2012 edition. We just completed the revision cycle for the 2021 edition. So that document will be available probably later this year. We'll see jurisdictions consider adopting it probably sometime during 2021. But one of the points I want to make before I actually get into this course discussion, since I've talked about revision cycles, each and every one of you have the ability to influence the requirements in this code. And there's really two ways that you can do that. One, you can do it individually. So if you go to nfpa.org/101, that will take you to a portion of the NFPA site that is devoted to the life safety code. From there, you go to a tab that talks about next edition. Now, if you go to next edition right now, it's still going to be talking about the 2021 edition since we haven't released that document. But once that document's released and sometime late this year, if I hit on that icon next edition, it will take me to a section that says, do I want to submit public input? And you don't need to be a member of NFPA. You can simply say, yes, you want to submit public input, and it's very user-friendly. You indicate you want to submit public input, it will take you to a different portion of the NFPA site where it will bring up the entire code for you, and you simply call up the paragraph that you want to change. You'll see that text populate your screen. You highlight the text you want to delete, you type in text you want to add or change, and you hit next, and it will give you the change in legislative format. No challenges in terms of trying to format it to look proper. It will do it for you. Then you go to the next screen and you have to indicate why you want to make that change. And the technical committees have to address every public input that comes in on the document. Now, in addition to looking at this individually, I indicated that in the past I've done some work with APA. APA has a code council, and they look after items of that they believe are of interest to you. So an alternative to looking at this individually, or in addition to doing this individually, because you could submit the change, print it, and then send it in to Billy at APA, and the code council can then look at it and say, this is something that APA wants to get involved in. We need to make sure that there's support for this, or maybe they might reach out to you with some additional comments where you can further revise your proposal, your public input before we've reached that deadline. So each and every one of you can make improvements to this document, and I encourage you to be involved. There are other ways you can do it through committee membership, etc., but this is a very easy way for you to influence this document. So what is it that we want to talk about today? We're going to provide an overview of NFPA 101. And again, I'm going to focus or try to focus on the portions of the document that really impact you as a facility personnel, facility manager at a campus for higher education. Our learning objectives, at the end of this program, you should be able to identify at least 3 changes in the 2018 edition of the code. Those are actually somewhat identified in the subsequent slides or the subsequent bullets, but again, we'll be talking about some of the changes in the 2018 edition. One of those changes is language that talks about mass notification systems and the need to do a risk analysis. I'll talk about that later. We will talk about regulations regarding crowd safety. Not that that's changed significantly in the 2018 edition, but clearly something that you potentially need to deal with. And there have been some changes that were intended to address a level of safety or some protection that for particular in classroom areas during active shooting incidents. Again, we'll talk about those, where they are, and even some potential subsequent modifications to that. So what is the Life Safety Code all about? Well, historically, this was called the Building Exits Code. and it really just talked about means of egress. But we've learned over the years that adequate life safety from fire, which is what's stated in the scope statement, minimize danger to life from the effects of fire, that adequate life safety from fire into other building. We do need to talk about things like contents and furnishings. We need to talk about interior finish, how quickly this fire may develop and spread in the building. A good example of that is Station Nightclub. And while, yes, there were some egress challenges during that incident, clearly the fact that that fire developed as quickly as it did due to the foam product on the walls in that building, that presented challenges in terms of our ability to even have an adequate time to get people out of the building, even if the building had adequate exits. And since I brought it up, we were part of the government's investigation team looking at that fire, and as designed, the building did have adequate exits. There were 4 exits out of the building. There were some operational challenges, lessons we can learn, in that one of the exits was at a kind of isolated location and not known to most of the occupants. A second exit was right next to the stage, and somebody told people, don't use that. That's not for people other than employees and people that are participating in the show, et cetera. So there's 2 out of the 4 exits that were not available to most of the occupants. One of the remaining, which is the main entrance exit for the assembly occupancy, had a restriction. We had a ticket table right there at the path to that exit, which reduced the available egress width and clearly caused a bottleneck at that location. So as designed, the building had adequate exits. Hopefully your buildings, as designed, have adequate exits. The design team has done their work. So some of the things we're going to focus on in this presentation is how do we make sure those egress facilities are reliable and usable in the case of this emergency. But then we see some additional bullets. And the next 3 bullets represent a change made or changes made in the scope of the Life Safety Code as it is contained in the 2018 edition. And we will address each of these individually. The first one says that the code also addresses emergency events involving hazardous materials. And I give you the paragraph numbers. Actually, I guess I didn't give you the 1 paragraph number. It's 117 when we talk about communications. The second bullet, we address reducing injury to occupants from falls, which I will argue a little bit later in the presentation. We've done that in the past, but there's some additional requirements that have been added to the document. And third, and one of particular interest to you because it's specifically targeting higher education facilities, is addressing communication to the occupants under emergency conditions. So all 3 of those paragraphs, 115, 116, 117, are new to the 2018 edition of this code. To really understand what it is the Life Safety Code attempts to do, we really need to combine the scope statement with the purpose statement. So the scope is to minimize danger to life from fire and similar type emergencies. The purpose is to provide a minimum set of requirements for safety to life from fire and life safety and similar emergencies. Now, a question that often comes up is when we're dealing with life safety, is minimum really appropriate? Why are we dealing with minimums? So what I'd like you or suggest that you consider is that this is not providing a minimum level of safety. It's providing a minimum set of requirements that if I meet these requirements, I should be providing an acceptable level of safety. And in Chapter 4, I don't have it on a slide, but in Chapter 4, we actually do define what the goal is of this code as it relates to life safety from fire. And if you care to look at it subsequent to the presentation, it's in paragraph 411. And it indicates that we're providing reasonable safety from fire to the occupants who are not intimate with the initial fire development. And that what we do to improve their survivability will in fact improve the survivability of those intimate with a fire, but that's not really the target, the level of safety that we're trying to provide. So what's all that mean? So in your typical dorm facilities, if a fire occurs in the sleeping room, clearly anybody else in that dorm is not considered intimate with the fire. So the code intends to provide an acceptable or reasonable level of safety to everyone else in the building. Assuming that that dorm, and I know under COVID-19, some of you are going to single resident dorm rooms, but assuming that that dorm room has more than one occupant, depending upon the actual scenario, the code might actually be striving to protect the second person in that room. If I were in one of your dorm rooms, and let's say there are 2 residents in this dorm room, and I happen to fall asleep while I'm smoking, whether I should do that or not, we'll just set that aside, but I'm doing it and I fall asleep while I'm smoking. I ignite the bed linen around me. I am considered intimate with the fire ignition. Now, the fact that you have a smoke alarm in there, the fact that you might have fast response sprinklers in there, they will improve my survivability. But the goal of the code really is to make sure that second person, assuming that second person is not also intimate with the fire scenario, that person should have adequate notification and time to respond and be able to get out of that room. That's what the stated goal of the life safety code is. So this minimum set of requirements is what I need to do to achieve that level of life safety. Now, one of the things that makes the life safety code different than building codes, and we state in chapter 1 as an expansion of the scope section, that the life safety code doesn't address everything, that it is limited to life safety from fire and similar emergencies. So other issues, be those wind events, seismic events, structural integrity from issues other than fire, et cetera, those are addressed by a building code. Some of our fire prevention requirements are addressed by a fire code. So we're focusing on life safety from fire and similar emergencies. But the life safety code, different than a building code, does apply to new and existing buildings. And what do I mean by an existing building? If you're in a state that has adopted the life safety code, when they adopted the life safety code, they provided, the state would have said the code is effective on such and such a date. I'm going to assume for our discussion here today that your jurisdiction adopted the 2018 edition of the Life Safety Code effective January 1, 2020, earlier this year. Anything that existed in your building prior to January 1 of this year would then be considered existing. Anything that is new, whether it's a change you make to that building or it's new construction, that it would be a new building or new occupancy. And the code set up that with most occupancies, we have 2 chapters, an even number chapter that applies to new buildings and an odd number chapter that applies to existing buildings. There are a few exceptions to that, but most of the chapters I have 2 chapters to deal with. So that tells me which chapter I go to. If my building was in existence prior to January 1 of this year, I'm going to go to the odd number chapter where there's an odd number chapter. By the way, if there is not an odd number chapter, the even number chapter applies to both new and existing. We're not saying the code does not have any requirements for those occupancies that are located in an existing building. But carrying forward this concept of existing buildings, there's some interesting provisions. Really, it's authority that the code gives to regulator, what we call NFPA terminology, the authority having jurisdiction. And having previously been with a state fire marshal's office, the first one I'm going to talk about, I will admit I am not a major proponent of this particular item. And the reason for that is that it's giving me, the AHJ, the fire official, the ability to modify the code. Now, this code is written by this technical committee of experts knowledgeable in this area. Who am I as a single fire official somewhere, really am I equipped and prepared to modify the code required? This is not an equivalency. Chapter 1 says you can submit an equivalency request or an alternative method of compliance. You prove to me that you're providing an equivalent level of safety, and that's fine. This paragraph 465 actually says, hey, I can modify the code. The code says X, but I'm going to do X minus 2 or something. All right. Now, there are some restrictions. It does say the authority having jurisdiction may modify the code for existing buildings only, provided in the minds of the authority having jurisdiction, there is still a reasonable degree of safety, and the ability to fix the non-compliant condition is determined to be impractical. Again, in the judgment of the authority having jurisdiction, compliance is impractical. You might think it's impractical. You're going to have to convince the authority having jurisdiction that it is not practical. Now, there's some instances where, yes, I can say I understand where this paragraph would be applicable, but I'm suggesting that you really should first look at, is there an alternative method? Is there an equivalency that I could be asking for before we really go down this path of modification? Now, for historic buildings, and I know some of our campuses do have historic buildings on them, same provision giving the authority having jurisdiction the ability to modify the code. However, it no longer needs to be impractical to fix. So a quick little example, project that we worked on in Colonial Williamsburg when they were rehabbing the courthouse in the center of Colonial Williamsburg. They wanted to be able to reenact colonial period trial, and they indicated that there could be more than 50 people in the building during this reenactment. That made this building an assembly occupancy. The building had one way out. That's deficiency number 1 for an assembly occupancy. The door swung in. That's deficiency number 2 for an assembly occupancy. And the moment I stepped through this exterior door, I stepped down. The floor level on both sides of that door were not essentially at the same level. So 3 conditions. The historians would say, we can't change that. Architectural students come from around the country to study colonial period architecture. And if we make these changes, we're rewriting history. And that's something we should not be doing, or at least from a historic building. I don't want to get into some political issues that we're confronted with today. At least from a historic building standpoint, we shouldn't be rewriting history. Could they have fixed any of those? Absolutely. But our analysis showed that they offered a reasonable level of safety. The foundation, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, was comfortable with what we proposed. The authority having jurisdiction actually hired a third party to review our work. The third party, and therefore subsequently the authority having jurisdiction, determined that there was a reasonable level of safety. And if you go there today, you have a potential for an assembly occupancy with one way out, door swinging inward, and this down as you go out that door. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the other details how we provided that reasonable level of safety. I'm going to Cam. I'm getting a message that my internet will deal with that by shutting down the webcam. That historic buildings, we can look at some operational considerations that I might not do in other buildings. Now, this last one is really the one that affects you the most. And this is paragraph 466. And it says that you can continue to operate an existing building even if you are not in full compliance with the code. You can do that for a limited but reasonable period of time, and that time period is based upon the magnitude of expenditure, the disruption of the service, and the degree of hazard. So let's assume the photograph we see on the right is a door into a stair enclosure, an exit enclosure. And I see that somebody has disabled the latch on this door. This is a fire door. It should be self-latching. It's not going to cost much to correct the actual deficiency that we see in the photo. There might be some additional cost to try to avoid this in the future by turning this door into an automatic closing door, which the code would allow. But the actual correction of this deficiency can be done at minimal cost. It probably is not that disruptive to the service, to what we're trying to do in this building, to simply remove this duct tape from the latch. The staff or somebody in the building might argue it's disruptive in that I have to operate this panic hardware device, but it really doesn't disrupt your program that you're trying to offer. The degree of hazard, that might vary. What is the occupancy I'm in? How many exits are there, et cetera. But for the most part, this is something that I think most AHJs would probably argue this has to be corrected immediately. Now, if they looked at that same door and it was self-latching, but it didn't have the proper fire protection rating, now they may come back and say, okay, there's some cost involved. It's going to be a little disruptive. If you try to do this during periods when you're offering classes or the building is otherwise occupied, you've potentially caused an obstruction for people to use one of the exits, so on and so forth. So they might say, look, we're going to give you 30 days or something to correct this condition. And then they'll come back in a reinspection and verify that you corrected the condition. Now, talking a little bit more about existing buildings. As I said, the code addresses existing buildings. So the intent of this code is that you will be in compliance with all the requirements for an existing building, and being in compliance can include things like an equivalency, unless you have that modification that I previously talked about. If you choose to do some work in your building, you will potentially, and I have to emphasize potentially, because this is different than what some additions to the code a number of years ago said, where it typically said anything you do in an existing building has to meet the requirements for new. It no longer says that. And I've got a slide where we will talk about Chapter 43 in more detail. So you may be able to keep what's there, or you might have to make some enhancements, some improvements to your building. The code goes further to say that when you are doing work in an existing building, you are not allowed to reduce. I'm going to put both of these arrows up at the same time. You are not allowed to reduce the existing level of safety in that building unless it exceeds that which is required for new. So my arrow on the right where it says stop not permitted, the fact that January 1, 2020, your state went to a new edition of the Life Safety Code, and that then made you an existing building, and the requirements for an existing building are less severe than they are for a new building, doesn't mean you can relax your requirement. And I know this isn't necessarily a big healthcare audience that I'm talking to right now, but there's a great example in healthcare. The corridor width requirements for an existing healthcare occupancy is 4 foot minimum width. For new construction, it's 8 foot. So as we transition to a newer edition of the code, it doesn't allow me, this graphic indicates that I am not allowed to reduce the width of that corridor below 8 feet because I already meet the requirements for new construction. However, if my corridor is 12 foot and I only need to have 8 foot, then yes, I can do a rehab project and I can go ahead and reduce the width of that corridor down to 8 foot. But notice we do say with caution and research. It's very simple for me to get a phone call and say, Bill, I've got a existing building. It's got a 12-foot wide corridor. We're doing a rehab project. Can I reduce it to 8 foot? And I say, well, sure. You know, if it's healthcare, Chapter 18 says the minimum width of a corridor in a new healthcare is 8 foot. But that may not be the end of what I need to really look at. Is there some reason the corridor was built as a 12-foot wide corridor? Was it part of an equivalency? Is there another code out there that requires a 12-foot wide corridor? Do you have chairs in the corridor that really reduce the effective width of your corridor down to 8 feet? You know, so I can't just simply say, yes, go ahead and do it. There needs to be some research involved before one can reduce that width down to 8 foot. All right, as I said, obviously the code deals with a lot of egress issues. And what I really want to focus on with this slide is two things. What is the definition of means of egress? And at least in a certain type of building on your campus, where do the means of egress requirements start? So generally speaking, the means of egress starts at any occupiable portion of your building. If I were to ask this as a question, sometimes I'll get the answer, oh, it starts at the room door or my office door or something. No, it starts at an occupiable portion of the building. And it is that path of travel to get you outside of the building and all the way to a point of safety. So there's a couple things I picked up in that language that I used, and I didn't quote the definition verbatim, but it is more than just getting the people outside of the building. Notice that one of the three portions of my means of egress is something called exit discharge. In many buildings, exit discharge is exterior to the building. And it's that portion of my means of egress that gets me from the termination of the exit to this thing that we call a public way. And a public way is something deeded and dedicated for public use. It's at least 10 foot wide, at least 10 foot clearance, and it's open to the outside air. Sounds like a street to me. So the mere fact that I get somebody out of your building and they can gather at an assembly point in a parking lot, that can satisfy all of your emergency planning needs. That's what you can do for drills, etc. But from that assembly point, those occupants still need to be able to move away from the building till they get to this thing called a public way. Now, many of you, even on campus, in your multi-building campuses, you have streets. They operate the same as a public street does. You know, people can't come in and just block the street, build a building on the street. So while it might not meet the strictest interpretation of my definition of public way, I would typically consider the streets on most of your campuses as a public way. But I am seeing on more and more of your campuses that you're closing some of those streets down and you're turning them into a pedestrian walkway. So that might change where this public way is, and that I want people to move along this pedestrian walkway till they do get to a space that's deeded or dedicated to public use. So not an easy analysis to do on a lot of campuses, higher education campuses, but something that I do need to take into account. The reason for raising this first point is that as you go through the code, there are provisions that only apply to the exit access portion of the means of egress, such as travel distance. There are requirements that only apply to the exit, such as the requirements in 713 that talk about the exit enclosure and what you can and can't do with an exit enclosure. And then there are requirements that talk about exit discharge. And we'll come back and visit that in a subsequent slide. Now, the other point I want to make on this slide that is unique to a certain type of building on your campus, and I'm talking about dormitories. So dormitories, we say that the means of egress actually does start at the corridor door to that sleeping room. Now, I know a lot of you are using suites now, so probably I should clarify that to say it would be the door to the suite of sleeping rooms. But within the dwelling unit, if I can call it that, within your residential unit itself, we use this concept called means of escape. And it's the same thing we do in 1 and 2 family dwellings, and we do it within an apartment unit itself, where we actually do relax some of these requirements. And the means of egress requirements start at the corridor door. So I wanted to make sure that point was understood. You can see that text in 28.2 or 28 or 29 if you're dealing with existing dorms, 28, 29, 2, 1, 2, where we talk about within the dwelling unit or guest room, if I'm talking about a hotel, within that unit, that's means of escape. And for means of escape provisions, I go to chapter 24 for 1 and 2 family dwellings and find those requirements. Now, I want to talk a little bit about maintenance of the means of egress. And you notice I have on my slide XX. XX is the occupancy chapter number. And this will vary from one occupancy chapter to another. I happen to pull the requirements out of chapter 12 and 13 for assembly occupancies. I would note that there may be some occupancy chapters where it might not be the 0.7 section. Or I'm sorry, it's in the 0.7 section, but it may not be 7.1 as we see it for assembly occupancies. So since we have assembly occupancies on our campuses, what are some of the requirements that apply to the maintenance of our means of egress? Well, one of those requirements is that prior to each opening of the assembly occupancy, whether it's your field house or it's your theater, performing arts center, or a large auditorium for educational purposes, prior to opening that space for occupancy, the means of egress are to be inspected. And this really goes back to the number of fires that we've had in some types of assembly occupancies where not all of the exits were readily available to the occupants. Maybe I'm the only one that has experienced this, but far too many times I've gone to use the restrooms in a restaurant, which are often back a corridor someplace, leading to one of the other exits from the building or the space. And as I'm trying to navigate my way back to the bathroom, I find this is where they store the high chairs. This is where there are some boxes because they don't have enough room to store some of their supplies elsewhere in the restaurant. That's what we're looking for. Can I simply get to and use the means of egress? I was teaching a seminar in Maryland for a group of code officials, and it was being held in this restaurant, meeting space within this restaurant, and I got there and I did exactly this. I started to walk the egress path, and I got to an exit door to the outside that was locked. And I went to the manager of the facility and I said, in 5 minutes, you're going to start having a bunch of fire officials and building officials coming to this program. This door is locked. And you cannot have that as we start to operate this for our seminar. And I certainly don't think you want to have that audience here that we had, these code officials coming in and seeing that condition in your building. Okay, so that's just a generic inspection to make sure the egress path is usable. New to the 2012 edition of this code, there are provisions in Chapter 7 that say where required by an occupancy chapter, doors in the means of egress shall be inspected annually if the door has panic or fire exit hardware, it's a door into an exit enclosure, it has some type of electrical locking mechanism on it, or it has some other special locking arrangement that's a section in Chapter 7 where we talk about special locking arrangements. Similar to what I see here. This device is what I call delayed egress hardware. It does not allow me to immediately go through that door. Well, because of the technology associated with these devices, which to the best of my knowledge, they're very reliable, we're still going to require that there be an inspection of this device and the associated provisions, such as the fact that I'm supposed to have lighting and the sign that we see and so forth. We're going to inspect and make sure that these requirements from Chapter 7 are being met on an annual basis. There's another type of door inspection that was new to the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code because it was new to the 2010 edition of NFPA 80. And it requires an annual inspection of all fire doors. Prior to the 2010 edition, I only need to do this for special types of fire doors, my vertical rolling doors, my horizontal sliding doors, and things like that. It was expanded to include all swinging doors. I would caution you, only because I've seen how this requirement has played out in the healthcare community as they adopted the 2012 edition of the code, that in particular, if you're using an outside vendor, just because they tell you there's some deficiency with the door doesn't necessarily mean there is. And I would review some of those reports with a careful eye to see if the requirement is something that is for new doors and should not have applied to that existing door that you have. Because NFPA 80 does not require me to upgrade a door. So for example, you might have wire glass in your fire door. Today you can't use wire glass, but whatever glass you do have in your fire door that's rated glass, it has to be labeled. For that period of time, there was a period of time when I could use wire glass and it had to be labeled. But your building may be older, predate that label requirement, and therefore there's no label on the wire glass. So just to share with you the healthcare experience, because they've had to comply with this now since CMS went to the 2012 edition of the code approximately 4 years ago. I have client healthcare facilities that have had door inspections done by third-party services that are merely looking at the current requirements and have failed as high as 100% of the fire doors in their facility. So the NFPA 80 committee is actually working on this. I have a change that I proposed, NFPA 80. It made it through the first draft. We'll see if it makes it through the second draft. That in an annex note says, while this door inspection is required by this edition of the code, that the inspector is to be applying the requirements appropriate for the door at the time the door was installed, and not necessarily these new requirements. And that will help to address that failure rate that I've seen in some of the healthcare facilities. All right, I mentioned earlier that there's been an expansion of scope. So let's just briefly talk about this expansion of scope. With respect to hazardous materials, there's not a whole lot of requirements written into this code for hazardous materials. If you go to paragraph 873, what you will basically see is that if I have hazardous materials in the building, I potentially need to go to another NFPA document, NFPA 30 for flammable liquids as an example, to find the requirements. When I pick up NFPA 30, it does talk about some egress requirements. If I have storage outside the building, how close can it be to my exit discharge path? How much of this material am I allowed to have in this building before I potentially have to call it high hazard contents? And that gets me to 712. 712 is a portion that's been in the code for decades that talks about those areas that we're going to consider to be high hazard contents. There aren't going to be a lot of those on your campus, but there could be some. These are areas where I can get a very fast developing fire or potentially an explosion. You know, not your typical room and contents fire that you're going to have in your classroom buildings or even your lab building, most of your lab buildings or your dormitory spaces. 115 is the paragraph that added this to the scope. And chapter 4 is where we talk about general requirements. Again, it talks about what some of our goals and objectives are with regard to hazardous materials. The second expansion of scope that I identified earlier is slips and falls. Now, what I've tried to do in the first bullet is to identify that we've been doing this for years in the Life Safety Code. There's a lot of time the committee has spent on the geometry of that stair that you're looking at. We have requirements for guards on that stair. We have requirements that talk about walking surfaces in the means of egress. They've been there. So while the scope may not have specifically identified slips and falls, there are clearly provisions in the code that do address the safe use of this egress path. And that's been our argument in the past, that we need to address stair geometry, or we need to address the walking surface, because that is our path of egress during this fire emergency, and it needs to be safe to use. The fact that we are making it safe to use in an emergency is also making it relatively safe to use under normal circumstances. So what changed? Well, what changed is a requirement in Chapter 24, which is 1 and 2 family dwellings, that requires grab bars on bathtubs and shower enclosures. Now, remember what I said earlier. The space within your dormitory room is means of escape. And the chapter sends me back to Chapter 24 for the means of escape provisions in that dwelling space. So while you might have very few 1 and 2 family dwellings, maybe the president's house or something like that, you may have very few 1 and 2 family dwellings. There is a portion of your egress path that is means of escape, which has to comply with 24.2, and these requirements are in 24.2.8 and there is no existing, so 24.2.8. So it does apply for new construction. Okay? It's not a retrospective requirement. So you may see your fire marshal enforcing these requirements. The proponent for this argued that, well, what if I'm in the shower during a fire emergency? I personally felt that that was a little bit of a stretch, and I think that's why you see the expansion of the scope, is to say we are going to reach out and address some of these other slip, trip, and fall issues. This is the first one. I don't know if there's others coming down the pike, but clearly the scope of the document has been expanded. And then emergency communications. And this one I want to spend a little bit of time on, because again, those of you involved with higher education facilities, you are the ones specifically targeted by this provision. So one of the challenges that both NFPA and the ICC had when this provision came before their committees is there's no occupancy classification for university buildings. You have assembly occupancies, you have classroom space that is a business occupancy, you have sleeping accommodations, that's dormitory. So your buildings consist of a variety of different occupancies that are addressed by either the building code or the life safety code. So what you're going to see in some of these subsequent slides is language that in several of these occupancy chapters are specifically targeted to classroom scenarios or buildings being used by universities and colleges. The concern arose that NFPA 72, the National Fire Alarm Code, requires a risk analysis for a mass notification system. But the way or where it's located in NFPA 72 really only triggers the requirement if you've already made the commitment to put in a mass notification system. So the industry and even some campus-related safety organizations went to the codes and said, we need to trigger this risk analysis in the code, and this risk analysis needs to determine, is there a need for a mass notification system? So in the Life Safety Code, the way we see that formatted is Chapter 9, which is a core chapter, establishes requirements for all occupancy, says where required by, and chapters 12 through 42 are my occupancy chapters, and that's typically where you'll see that requirement. You could see it in high-rise as well. High-rise provisions are in Chapter 11, special structures. Where required by chapters 11 through 43, a risk analysis for mass notification shall be provided in accordance with the requirements in NFPA 72. And then if the risk analysis determines that there is a need for a mass notification system, then that system shall be installed in accordance with NFPA 72. So in what buildings on your campus do you need to consider, and when do you need to consider doing this risk analysis? High-rise buildings with a total occupant load of 5,000 or more, or where you have an occupied story greater than 420 feet. There aren't a lot of those on college campuses. But that is the section that's in the high-rise section, 11.8. Now we get into ones that really affect you. Any new fire alarm system, so this could be a new building or a replacement fire alarm system going into an assembly occupancy with an occupant load of 500 or more, you need to do a risk analysis. Educational occupancy isn't you. By definition, educational occupancy is up to and including 12th grade. So unless you also have a high school campus or something on your college campus, I know that you're doing educational services, but you don't have an educational occupancy. Fire alarm systems in dormitories with an occupant load greater than 100. You have a lot of those. Fire alarm systems in business occupancies containing a classroom where the building is owned, rented, leased, or operated by a college or university. So you can see where those last two occupancy groups, residential and business, really targeted the higher education facility. The assembly one actually goes beyond just higher education. If I had a basketball rink or in a civic center or something, doesn't have to be associated with a college campus. I would still need to do this risk analysis. Now, many of you have a risk analysis already performed. Unfortunately, and I wish more of the occupancy chapters had done this, only the residential occupancy, the dormitory chapter, put in another paragraph that said applicable portions of an existing risk analysis shall be permitted to be used when a new building is added to the campus. So if you are building another new dormitory that is essentially the same as existing dormitories on your campus, you don't have to do this risk analysis. It's probably covered by the existing risk analysis. But if you are a university campus that does not have a basketball arena, your basketball team plays off campus somewhere, and now you decide to add a basketball arena, then yes, the risk analysis does need to be done because there's some different hazards now associated with this larger place of assembly that maybe your current risk analysis did not address. You at least have to look at it to see if it's within the scope of the previous risk analysis or not. Now, NFPA 72 has made some changes in the annex. It kind of gets me to the same place. But again, I really wish that more of the occupancy chapters in NFPA 101 had tried to do this. And trust me, APA worked in the ICC arena and the NFPA arenas to try to address some of your concerns in this area. And this was one of them. So we were successful within some of the committees, but not necessarily all of the committees. So that's that emergency communication scope. So we've addressed the three expansions of scope: hazardous materials, slip, trips, and falls, and emergency communication. So now I want to move on to another objective. I said we would talk about crowd managers. And you probably already have a system in place for some of your larger assembly occupancies, like your football stadia and your field house or basketball arena, what have you. But remember that this requirement in Chapter 12 and 13, both new and existing assembly occupancies, requires that you have a crowd manager whenever the occupant load of this space exceeds 250 people. So there are some other assembly occupancies on your campus, maybe a performing arts arena or something like that, where your plan needs to include having these qualified, trained individuals that understand what their role and what their responsibilities are with regard to evacuation and movement of the occupants, reporting emergencies, use of fire safety equipment, etc. So that's all spelled out in 12.13.7.6, what this crowd manager needs to do. And just making sure that you're aware that it applies to more than just your very large assembly occupancies. So one other thing I want to talk about before we kind of transition to a different topic, this relates to, again, one of our specific objectives. In the 2018 edition of the code, there was an attempt to modify an existing requirement that said you're allowed to have no more than one releasing operation to open a door. Now, there are some exceptions. So in your dorm rooms, new, you might have 2. Existing dorm rooms might have 3. But in most instances, the code says that I should be able to open this door with one releasing operation. During the development of the 2018 edition of the code, and again, APA was involved in these discussions, the concern was raised that to protect the occupants, in particular in classroom areas, we may want or need to lock the door to that classroom. And while there is hardware available to allow me to do that and still operate the door on the egress side with one releasing operation, think about hotel rooms you've been in, that's not necessarily an inexpensive upgrade. And what we've seen, in particular in some of our, K through 12 public schools, is a lot of pressure for facilities to enhance the locking capability of their schools. And most of them will say, well, we don't have the money to buy these lock sets that meet the single releasing mechanism. Therefore, there's a series of aftermarket products that are available, most of which do not meet the code because they would require some special knowledge, effort, tool, or key to get that device off the door and be able to open the door on the egress side. So the attempt was to allow 2 releasing operations. There was opposition to this, at least some of which came from the door hardware industry. Because again, they have hardware that will solve this problem, just not necessarily an inexpensive solution. If you think about retrofitting all your classroom doors. So at the last minute, as the voting is done by the NFPA membership, the committee's work in this effort was changed. And basically the occupancies that I've identified do contain language that talks about the ability to lock classroom doors, but they either directly or indirectly rely or still restrict on the egress side to you being able to open this door with a single releasing operation. So it's not as simple as adding a deadbolt to the door. Now, I will say that one of the pluses in this new section does say that the door needs to be unlockable from the corridor side, like we see here. Because I also don't want a situation where we've secured the classroom and first responders that we need to be able to get into that classroom can't easily get into that classroom. So there were portions of this that were kept, portions that were not. And I will say the committee has continued to work on this for the 2021 edition, and you will most likely see some improvements in this language in the 2021 edition. So that takes me back to my alternative compliance method strategy. NFPA, and this is reflected in an annex note, considers future editions of the code enhancements or improvements to prior edition. So there are times when, as a consultant, I've reached out to the authority having jurisdiction and said, I know you're required to enforce the 2018 edition of the code, but there's some language in the 2021 code that might better address this situation. Would you allow us to propose that language as an acceptable alternative or an equivalency? That's solely up to the AHJ as to whether they will allow it, but it's certainly a strategy that we've used at times. So I want to go back to this concept of existing buildings. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We actually did talk about inspection, testing, and maintenance of water-based fire protection systems in the last program. But understand that anything required by this code is required to be properly inspected, tested, and maintained. And the various standards that address that, such as NFPA 72 or NFPA 25 or NFPA 10, they all place that responsibility on the owner. The owner can contract with somebody to perform some of the tasks, maybe all of the tasks, but the ultimate responsibility for inspection, test, and maintenance rests with the owner. And attorneys that I've worked with in some litigation matters, they just love that language, because most of the time the codes aren't that clear as to whose responsibility it is to comply, but it clearly is under inspection, test, and maintenance. If something you see on the slide is not required in your building, remember, and you do not want to incur the expense to properly maintain that system or equipment, remember you need to go to the requirements for new construction to verify that it is not required for a new building. And if it's not required for a new building, you are not required to inspect, test, and maintain it. But if you choose not to inspect, test, and maintain it, you need to remove the component that's not being tested or inspected if that component could create a false sense of security to the public. Probably the most widely used application of that language is many of you might have at some point in time had occupant use hose on your standpipe systems in your building, and you have subsequently removed that hose. Why? Because in almost all instances, the building codes, the fire codes today do not require occupant use hose. So once it's removed, obviously that eliminates the inspection, test, and maintenance requirement, and you've removed that portion that could create a false sense of security by me going down and trying to use that hose during a fire emergency. On a previous slide, I also talked about Chapter 43, and to be honest, we could spend the entire 90 minutes or more on Chapter 43. So I just want to very quickly say, what does Chapter 43 do? Well, it was new to the 2006 edition of Life Safety Code, so it's been around for a while now. But it takes what many of us used to call an alteration or renovation project, and it divides that work into 3 different categories. And remember my graphic from before. It now tells me, can I go to the existing building chapter, or do I need to go to the chapter that deals with new construction? So just quickly going through these categories, I don't think I need to define repair work. I'm restoring something to its original condition. Repair, I can just put back what's there. I don't have to upgrade in any way. You know, if there's a small piece of carpet that I'm repairing, there's really no fire safety benefit to providing an upgraded performance for this 4-inch by 4-inch square of carpet in this large room. Now, if you are replacing all the carpet, you get into the next category of work, which is renovation. Renovation is where I'm doing work, but it does not result in any reconfiguration of the space. So if the wall that we see being constructed was an existing wall, and remember, we meet the requirements for the existing occupancy involved, and I am merely rebuilding that wall exactly where it is, I can rebuild it as required for existing. If new construction were to require a 1 hour corridor there, but existing doesn't require a rated corridor, and the existing wall was non-rated, I can rebuild a non-rated wall. If it's a 1 hour wall, now remember, I can't reduce the level of safety unless it exceeds that which is required for new, then I would rebuild it as a 1 hour wall. And that's really to address the domino effect. Once I put in a 1 hour wall, that might now require changes to my HVAC system with dampers and so on and so forth. So we're trying to encourage people to reuse existing buildings and do it in a reasonably safe manner. The only thing that I need to upgrade when it comes to renovation in the life safety code is interior finish. Now, if I look at similar provisions in the International Existing Building Code, it would also say that I need to upgrade lead paint, lead solder, and wire glass. So if I have to replace any of those 3 items, you would need to upgrade and meet the requirements for new as well. A modification says I'm changing the space in some way. So I think the easiest example of this is an office building where I have a new tenant moving in. I'm doing a modification of the suite, rearranging the suite to meet the needs of this new tenant. That is a modification. What that tells me is the design professional will identify on the drawings the area of work, the work area. And I only need to apply the code requirements within the work area and the work that I'm performing. If I am doing something new, I'm moving a wall, then I have to meet the requirements for new construction. So if that wall that we see is being relocated in any way, and it previously was a non-rated wall, but I chose to move the wall, now I have to build that new wall as a 1 hour wall. Now, what we have here might actually be more of a reconstruction activity. That's where the work I'm doing affects the egress from other spaces of the building, or I don't have the ability to occupy the building because I can't maintain the fire protection systems in service, or I can't maintain the means of egress. In that category of work, all new work has to meet the requirements for new construction, including if the work area is in a building that in new construction requires sprinkler protection, at a minimum, you will sprinkler the work area. If the work area is more than 50% of the floor, you will sprinkler the entire story. If the work area is more than 50% of the building area, you will sprinkler the work area, the story where the work area is, or maybe it's multiple stories, and all levels below that work area. I would not have to go above the work area. Now, it might make sense to sprinkler at that time, but you're not required to do it. So reconstruction is the first time that we start talking about doing more work than what you might have originally intended us to do. Again, to encourage people to reuse existing buildings. There's also provision about change of use. So I had a project in the District of Columbia years ago where this building surrounded an outside courtyard on 4 sides, and the owner of the building decided to put a roof over this outside courtyard. They now created an atrium. No change of occupancy classification. Nothing's changed in the way the space was being used, but they created this atrium. Therefore, they had to meet the atrium requirements. They had to meet the requirements for that new use. Another example that you might see on your campuses is if you take a room that was not previously used as a storage room and you convert it to storage. That is a new use. It may now be a hazardous area, and the code may require some increased protection of that space because you're using it as a storage room. Change of occupancy classification, I think we all know what that is. I'm going from business occupancy classification to assembly occupancy classification. But the difference in Chapter 43, and I'll use that scenario. So if I were to rent some space in an office building off campus for a classroom, and the classroom is going to have an occupant load of 50 or more people, that is an assembly occupancy. previously the building was a business occupancy. So what Chapter 43 says is that I do not need to go to Chapter 12 for assembly occupancy to determine what the requirements are. I can go to the Chapter 13 for existing assembly occupancies, even though I was business. I can go to Chapter 13 because there's a table that talks about the hazard categories for each of the occupancies, and business and assembly are at the same level. I don't personally think they should be, but you can thank the state of Maryland for that. That's what they did when they developed a Maryland Rehabilitation Code, which was the foundation of this. The original effort started in New Jersey, but Maryland created something, which used the Life Safety Code as a basis, and that's what found its way in, was the origin of Chapter 43 in the Life Safety Code, was the Maryland Building Rehabilitation Code. In Maryland, they condensed down what was 5 different hazard categories down to 4. And they wanted to be able to take a lot of unoccupied buildings in, let's say, downtown Baltimore, and change them from a mercantile use to a business use, from an in factory use or industrial use to a residential use, without requiring us to meet all the requirements for new construction. So they allows that, so they're all at the same hazard category, so it would allow me to stay in the existing occupancy chapter, with the exception of 4 things. Sprinklers, I go to the even number chapter. Fire alarm, I go to the even number chapter. Hazardous areas in that new occupancy, I go to the even number chapter because they vary from one occupancy classification to another. And then assembly in general is exempted. You can't use that provision. So my scenario of the business occupancy going to an assembly use, I would in fact still have to go to Chapter 12. And that's just because of the inherent additional risk associated with that assembly use. And I think we all know what an addition is, so I don't think I need to go into that. So I just want to talk about a few other things that as facility managers, you should be aware of. Without going into all the details, for each of your buildings, the design team would have identified the occupant load for the various spaces in your building. From that, they then determine the egress capacity. If I was in your position, I would be familiar with table 7312, which is where we identify these occupant load factors. And what I want to see is, has a change occurred that would substantially change the occupant load of the space? So we were the fire protection engineers of record for the new Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. It was a design build project, and we were part of the design build team. However, the original concept was developed by a different design team. They assumed that the space was going to be used as business clinics, not healthcare, or if it was healthcare, it was ambulatory healthcare, that it was, they assumed it was inpatient. So they calculated an occupant load at 240 square foot per person. However, the actual use of a lot of that space was clinics that were not healthcare, or healthcare clinics for outpatient services, which is ambulatory healthcare. Now, this is from the 2018 edition, but at the time of that project, we were actually using an earlier edition of the Life Safety Code, and the occupant load factor for business and ambulatory healthcare was 100 square foot per person. So as we got the project and we looked at the egress system and in the conceptual design, we said, this isn't going to work. We're going to have over twice the number of people in this space than what was assumed by the original design team. And while they're pouring the foundations, we had to come up with a solution to that, which did include adding some exit stair enclosures. So it wasn't a popular thing, but obviously something that had to be done. So again, you want to be aware of what are things that somebody might do in your building that's going to change the occupant load, such that you should make sure the design team reevaluates the egress calculations. Another concept that I want to introduce, and this isn't limited to COVID-19, but I see COVID-19 reopening of buildings where this is affected. In most occupancies, in the 2.4 section, you will find a requirement that everybody in the building has to have access to at least 2 exits. And you may be going into buildings today where they're closing an exit for whatever reason. If there are only 2 exits in the building, we no longer have access to 2 exits. The arrangement of the means of egress, that covers things like common path of travel and dead-end corridors or remoteness of the exit. So maybe my building has 3 exits. We're closing one of them, but by closing one of them, I've created a problem in that the 2 remaining are not adequately remote because I really measured that remoteness from one of the exits and that I'm still using and one that we closed. Because I only have to have 2 that meet that remoteness requirement. And then travel distance. I measure travel distance to the nearest exit. If you start closing exits in the building or telling people they can't use certain exits, I'm increasing travel distance to the nearest exit. So as you potentially do any of that, please make sure those egress requirements are being met. Exit discharge. I really put this in here only for one reason. The most common portion of my means of egress that is going to be overlooked, and I don't care whether I'm talking about design, plan review, inspections, or whatever, is the exit discharge path. A lot of people have a tendency to just open the door to the outside, say, yep, it's good, and not walk that egress path. Remember, the occupants need to have a path of travel to this thing called a public way. And then lastly, because we have assembly occupancies, I just pulled some other provisions out of point 7. I shaded the means of egress inspection because I had covered that in a previous slide. But there are restrictions in the assembly occupancy that talks about open flames and pyrotechnics. Again, Station Nightclub was a pyrotechnic ignition scenario. Furnishings, decorations, and scenery. Think about your performing arts center. And these aren't limited, some of these aren't limited to assembly occupancy. Your dorm, you'll see requirements for furnishings and decorations in dorms as well. The need to do fire drills varies from one occupancy chapter to another as to whether you need to do it, who needs to participate in the frequency of the drills, but it's there. Certain occupancy chapters will address smoking in the building. And if we do allow smoking, that we have to have proper ash receptacles. When you take your field house and you set it up for graduation services, you have all this loose seating. Well, it shouldn't be loose seating. I need to connect those chairs so that people can't just go in. And yeah, I've been there. I know what it's like. I walk into a presentation at a conference. I'm going to lift up one of those chairs and move it out so that I don't have to climb into the center. But I can't because they're interlocking. And that's to keep people from doing exactly what I tried to do, pull that chair up and move it someplace else. And that someplace else might be an aisle, an egress path for the folks in that area. Assembly occupancy requires the occupant load to be posted. So once I do this determination, I should have signage indicating what that occupant load is. Personally, it's not necessarily required by the code, but personally, I think a good practice in your multi-purpose spaces is to provide different occupant loads depending upon how the space is set up. So I might set it up one day with seating at tables. That's going to result in one occupant load. The next day it might be set up in a lecture format with just rows of chairs. That's a different occupant load. And then clothing effects and, having those in an area separated from the means of egress. So I just pulled some of this out of the assembly occupancy chapter. These are not relevant to certain occupancies. It is all in the point 7 section. That's the section that as an operator of a facility, you clearly want to focus on because that is addressing the things that you have control over or should be assuming control, which is the operating features of the building. So with that, I'll just mention that we do have a life safety discussion group on LinkedIn. Feel free to join that discussion group. It gets a reasonable amount of traffic. It gives you the ability to post questions. If you are concerned, you don't want your AHJ to know you're asking a question, you can send an email to us. We'll post a question anonymously, and then you'll start to get responses to that question. It is not really a monitored site, although we do monitor responses, and if we think the responses are technically inaccurate, we will reach out to the person posting that response and give them the option of either deleting their response, or if they choose not to do that, they need to understand that we will post a response that contradicts their response. And if you have any questions, and I'll make this slide deck available to Billy after the program. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I will respond to those questions. And let's see, Billy, what do we have? About 10 minutes. So do we have any questions?
Oh, we have questions. Our first question is, when NFPA updates existing chapters of the Life Safety Code, is there any consideration of timeline for compliance?
Yes, there is. So first off, you don't see a lot of changes to the existing occupancy chapters. I won't say there haven't been, because there have, but you won't see a lot of changes. We need to have a good bit of documentation to support that what we've been doing over the years is no longer providing a reasonable level of safety. An example of that is nightclubs. So they did lower the threshold at which existing nightclubs need to be protected with a sprinkler system. And the committee looked at it and said, you know, we're seeing fire after fire in these places of assembly. And we constantly say, well, if this had only complied with this requirement of the code or that requirement of the code, this probably would not have happened. And after a number of incidents like that, the committee said, well, it's obvious there are compliance issues and we need to do something else. So they increased, or they made it more restrictive as to when sprinklers were required in existing nightclubs. That one did not have a timeline. But there are other instances. The most common one that I can identify is where the code potentially requires sprinkler protection in existing high-rise buildings, where they will give an adoption period. For example, healthcare. When that first went into the 2009 additional life safety code, they gave facilities 12 years from the date of adoption of the code to get that existing high-rise building sprinkled. So they do look at it from whether we really need to make this change in existing, and then some of the more significant ones, they will put a timeline for compliance.
Thank you. Someone just made the comment that tape latches are items to be on the lookout for during COVID-19 measures to reduce touch points. That was just a comment made.
And that's a good point. If I can just expand on that, Billy, because
sure.
You know, it's a contact point, right? And one of the things that we do see happening is that people want to reduce these contact points. So the fact that I don't really have to come in contact with that panic hardware, I can basically use a portion of my body, maybe a portion that's protected with clothing, which I could do on the panic hardware as well. But think about doors that don't have panic hardware. If I tape over the latch, then I can just push that door open with some other part of my body. I will offer that there are other code permitted solutions, and that is that many of those doors can be changed to be automatic closing doors. So that's a great point. And I actually know of some door suppliers that have come out with other solutions to reduce the need to come in contact with that operating hardware.
Well, thank you for expanding on that. Next question, what happens if we are updating our FAS from an older version of MXL panel to XLS panel? Is a risk analysis needed?
I'm going to answer that with an it depends, but I'll also qualify it by saying most likely. Most fire officials that I deal with, the moment you change the control panel on the system, they consider it to be a new system. If you are merely extending the system into a new wing, they don't look at that. As long as that panel you have has the capacity to be expanded, they do not look at that as a new fire alarm system. The moment you install a new panel or replace an existing panel, they will consider it a new fire alarm system. There is not specific language that I can point to in the Life Safety Code that says that, but that's the way most code officials are interpreting the code.
Okay, thank you. Are labs considered as business occupancies or industrial for EC risk analysis?
Again, it depends. So if the lab is employing chemicals, we generally look at that lab as an industrial occupancy. If you have an engineering lab where we're actually manufacturing something, I would look at that as an industrial occupancy. If I have a computer lab, I'll look at that as a business occupancy. So there are annex notes that apply. They're connected to the definition of business occupancy and industrial occupancy that will basically state what I just stated, that it depends upon how the lab is being used. Ultimately, again, it's the authority having jurisdiction. I could go in on your behalf and argue that based upon the annex, and the annex is not mandatory, but based upon this annex note that this lab should be considered a business occupancy. And if the AHJ says no, it's an industrial occupancy, we're going to apply industrial occupancy requirements.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We removed the old cloth fire hoses and capped the standpipes. The standpipes are located in the old fire boxes. Do the fire boxes and standpipes also have to be removed?
Man, all of these are it depends. I should just say the answer to all your questions, Billy, are going to be it depends. In my opinion, no. Because I don't see an occupant that's going to go in and open up that hose valve with no hose attached to it and just start spraying water, unless they're doing it for devious purposes, just start spraying water out of that valve. So I don't think you do have to remove the hose valve as well, or the cabinet. I have seen many folks that have put some signage on those hose cabinets to say the hose has been removed as approved by the fire chief or fire official. And I will say that's a good thing to get, is that approval, because the fire codes typically say you are not allowed to remove a piece of fire protection equipment or a fire protection system without approval from the fire official.
Okay, thank you. We have a two-part question here. Does every means of egress need to be ADA accessible? And does that ADA accessibility requirement apply to the exit discharge path all the way to the public way?
Okay, so I think my answer to the first part is probably going to help with the answer to the second part. The code says I have to have at least, where I have a building that's accessible, I have to have at least 2 accessible means of egress. So no, not every means of egress would need to be accessible. The fact that I've made the building accessible to people with mobility impairments generally helps address the exit discharge. We do not require the exit discharge path to be paved. But the fact that you've made it accessible, you will typically pave that surface, you'll have curb cuts, etc. So you have it by default basically provided an accessible means of egress. So I will say that there are some exceptions. Where, to what I said, there's an exception that applies to existing buildings. There's exceptions that apply to certain occupancies like healthcare. So you really need to go into the 7.5 section of Chapter 7, where we talk about accessible means of egress, in particular 754, to see when you have to have it. But no, not every means of egress would necessarily need to be accessible.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question, and it's a long one. As far as existing buildings in 101, it says use the existing occupancy chapter or the decision of the AHJ that is there, required at time of issuance of CO now outdated, is still, I'm going to send this one to you, Bill. It's a long question, and I think it's a little too in-depth for our discussion today,
Okay.
and we're coming
That's
up
fine.
to the top of the hour.
Okay.
But, Ms. Roberts, you will get a definite answer to your question here from Bill. So, Bill, I want to say thank you so much. I'm getting all kinds of comments that, you know, great webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this for us. And I want to thank those of you who've taken time out of your schedule to listen to the webinar today. It will be put on the Apple website later this afternoon, and it will also be attached in a email. There'll be a link to the recording, and I'll send the presentation slides probably later this afternoon or first thing in the morning. So once again, thank you for attending. Be safe, stay healthy. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.